Somewhere in the high folds of Central Asia, beyond the passes that defeat ordinary travelers, beyond the ranges that block the horizon in every direction with walls of ice and stone, there is a kingdom. It has been there, according to the traditions that describe it, for longer than recorded history, a place of extraordinary wisdom and extraordinary peace, governed by a succession of enlightened kings, its people free from the suffering that defines ordinary human existence, its libraries containing the accumulated knowledge of civilizations that the surface world has long since forgotten. It is warm there, in the mythology, despite being surrounded by ice. It is green. The rivers run clear and cold from the mountains, and the air carries the scent of flowers that do not exist anywhere else. And the people who live there have solved, quietly and without fanfare, the problems that have occupied human beings since the beginning of conscious thought. How to live well, how to understand the nature of reality, how to be free. It is called Shambhala, and the traditions that describe it are not fringe mythology or casual folklore. They are embedded in some of the most sophisticated philosophical and religious systems that human civilization has ever produced. Shambhala appears in Tibetan Buddhist literature going back at least 1,000 years, in texts of great complexity and theological seriousness, written by scholars and contemplatives who were not describing a fairy tale but articulating a concept that was central to their understanding of history, reality, and the possibility of human liberation. It appears in Hindu traditions that may be considerably older. It appears in the born religion of Tibet, which predates Buddhism in the region and has its own version of the sacred hidden land. It appears in various forms in the oral traditions of nomadic peoples across Central Asia, from Mongolia to Kazakhstan to the high plateaus of Tibet itself, each tradition locating the hidden kingdom slightly differently, but agreeing on its essential qualities, its hiddenness, its purity, its extraordinary wisdom, its role in the ultimate destiny of the world. And it inspired, in the 20th century, one of the strangest and most consequential episodes of Western engagement with Eastern mysticism, a series of expeditions, political intrigues, and ideological appropriations that transformed a Tibetan Buddhist concept into a global cultural phenomenon, attaching it to causes and movements and ambitions that its original theological context would have found completely unrecognizable. Welcome back to the Sleep Atlas. Settle in, let the night do its work around you, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Subscribe to the Sleep Atlas and never miss another journey through history's most legendary and mysterious tales, crafted for restful nights. Tonight we go to the hidden kingdom. We go to Shambhala. Chapter 1. The Kingdom That Hides Itself. The earliest substantial descriptions of Shambhala in Tibetan Buddhist literature appear in texts associated with the Kalachakra Tantra, the Wheel of Time teachings, one of the most complex and elaborate systems within Vajrayana Buddhism, the form of Buddhist practice that developed in Tibet and the surrounding Himalayan region, and that remains one of the most sophisticated contemplative traditions in the world. The Kalachakra Tantra is not a simple text. It is a vast multi-layered system of cosmology, astronomy, medicine, ritual, and meditation practice concerned with the relationship between the cycles of time in the external world and the cycles of energy within the human body and mind. It is the kind of text that serious scholars spend decades with and still find inexhaustible, and it was introduced into Tibet from India sometime around the 11th century CE, carrying with it the tradition of Shambhala as the kingdom from which these teachings originated and to which they would ultimately return. In the Kalachakra tradition, Shambhala is not simply a pleasant place to live. It is the custodian of the highest teachings, the repository of the most profound wisdom available to human beings, preserved and practiced by a lineage of kings and a population of practitioners who have maintained an unbroken tradition of spiritual cultivation across an enormous span of time. The kingdom is ruled by a succession of enlightened kings, the Kulika kings or Kalki kings, depending on the tradition, each of whom embodies the full realization of the Kalachakra teachings and governs the kingdom according to principles of Dharma, the Buddhist term for the underlying order of reality, truth, and right action. There are traditionally said to be 32 of these kings, and when the last of them rules, a specific set of circumstances will obtain in the external world a period of darkness and conflict that will trigger the emergence of Shambhala from its concealment. The last Kalki king will lead the forces of Shambhala out into the world, defeat the forces of darkness, and inaugurate a new golden age of human civilization. This eschatological dimension, the idea that Shambhala's emergence is connected to the resolution of a world historical crisis, that the hidden kingdom will eventually reveal itself and transform everything, is one of the most important and most frequently misunderstood aspects of the tradition. In its original Tibetan Buddhist context, this is not a literal military prophecy. The forces of darkness are not a specific geopolitical enemy, but a metaphor for the forces of ignorance and delusion that the Buddhist tradition identifies as the root cause of human suffering. The battle that the last Kalki king wages is, at its deepest level, an internal one, the battle of wisdom against ignorance, of clarity against confusion, of liberation against the cycles of suffering that Buddhism defines as the fundamental problem of unexamined human existence. The emergence of Shambhala is not an invasion, it is an awakening, but the literal reading proved irresistible to certain audiences in the 20th century, and we will come to that. First, let us understand the place itself as the Tibetan tradition describes it. Shambhala is said to be shaped like an 8-petaled lotus flower, a circle of mountains surrounding a central valley with 7 inner ranges creating concentric rings of protection. The outermost mountains are said to be covered with ice and snow that reflect light in ways that make them invisible to ordinary perception, concealing the kingdom from those who are not ready to find it. The central valley is warm and fertile, watered by 4 rivers flowing from a central lake, planted with gardens and forests of extraordinary beauty. The capital city, Kalapa, is described with the specific, loving detail of someone describing a real place. Its architecture, its layout, its central palace, the materials from which it is constructed. The palace at the center of Kalapa is made of precious materials decorated with extraordinary art and contains in its innermost chamber the 3-dimensional mandala of the Kala Chakra, the symbolic diagram of the entire teaching rendered in physical form at the center of the kingdom that the teaching describes. The population of Shambhala in the traditional accounts is not superhuman in the way that the inhabitants of some mythological paradise traditions are described. They are human beings, remarkably long-lived, healthy, and happy by ordinary standards, but human beings nonetheless engaged in the ordinary activities of human life: farming, craftsmanship, family, study, meditation practice. The difference between Shambhala and the ordinary human world is not that its inhabitants have transcended the human condition, but that they live in conditions that support the full flowering of human potential. Physical conditions of beauty and abundance, social conditions of justice and wisdom, and a cultural tradition of extraordinary depth that provides the context within which human life can be lived at its highest level. Shambhala is not a paradise in the sense of a place where suffering is simply absent. It is a place where the conditions for genuine human development have been optimally arranged. This is, in some ways, a distinctly Buddhist conception of utopia, and it differs significantly from the utopian traditions of the Western world, which tend to imagine the good society as one in which the problems that cause suffering have been solved, scarcity eliminated, conflict resolved, injustice abolished. The Buddhist version does not claim that suffering has been eliminated in Shambhala. It claims that Shambhala provides the optimal conditions for practicing the path that leads to the liberation from suffering, which is a different thing and a more demanding thing, because it requires that the inhabitants still do the work. The hidden kingdom is not an escape from the human condition. It is the ideal context for engaging with it fully. The question of how to get to Shambhala is one to which the Tibetan tradition has given considerable thought, and the answers it has developed are characteristically more interesting and more philosophically demanding than a simple set of geographical directions. The tradition is quite clear that Shambhala cannot be reached by ordinary physical travel. People have attempted to travel there by the normal means available to Central Asian travelers, on foot and on horseback, through mountain passes, following the routes that connect the inhabited regions of Tibet and Mongolia and Central Asia, and they have not arrived. Not because the physical location does not exist in the tradition's understanding, but because the kingdom hides itself from those who are not ready to find it. The mountains that conceal it are invisible to ordinary perception. The passes that lead to it are not visible on any ordinary map. What the tradition describes as the prerequisite for finding Shambhala is, in essence, a certain level of spiritual development, a purification of perception and intention such that the concealment that hides the kingdom from ordinary sight is no longer effective. This is a concept that the Tibetan tradition elaborates with considerable philosophical sophistication. The concealment of Shambhala is not understood as a physical barrier, a wall or a locked door, but as a perceptual one. The kingdom is there. The problem is the quality of perception of the person looking. A mind clouded by ignorance and desire cannot perceive what a purified mind can perceive directly. The path to Shambhala is therefore not a geographical route but a contemplative one, the path of practice that purifies perception to the point where the hidden becomes visible. This means that the texts which describe Shambhala and give directions to it are understood within the tradition as having two levels of meaning simultaneously. The outer level is the geographical description, the mountains, the valleys, the distances, the landmarks. The inner level is the description of a meditative and spiritual path, the stages of practice, the qualities of mind to be developed, the obstacles to be overcome. Reading the directions to Shambhala is, on this understanding, simultaneously a geographical exercise and a contemplative one, and the person who has fully understood the inner meaning of the directions has, in some sense, already arrived at the destination they describe. The journey and the arrival are the same thing. The map is the territory. This understanding that Shambhala is simultaneously a physical place and a state of mind, simultaneously a geographical reality and a metaphor for the goal of spiritual practice, is the key to understanding why the tradition has been so durable and so resistant to the kind of debunking that simply producing a map and showing that the kingdom is not there might seem to accomplish. You cannot debunk Shambhala with a map, because the tradition has always been explicit that a map is not sufficient to find it. You cannot debunk it with a failed expedition, because the tradition has always been explicit that ordinary physical travel is not the means of access. The tradition is, in this specific sense, structured in a way that makes it genuinely difficult to argue with on its own terms, because its own terms include the acknowledgement that the kingdom is not findable by the methods that a skeptic would propose to use to look for it. Terma is a concept in Tibetan Buddhist tradition that is relevant here, because it connects Shambhala to a broader pattern of hidden knowledge in the tradition. Terma, literally treasure, refers to teachings and texts that were hidden by great masters of the past, concealed in physical locations or in the minds of specific individuals to be discovered at a future time when conditions are right and the appropriate discoverer, the Terton or treasure revealer, encounters them. The tradition of Terma is extensive and well documented within Tibetan Buddhism, and it reflects an understanding of time and transmission that is quite different from the linear, progressive model of knowledge development that the Western intellectual tradition tends to assume. Knowledge is not always accumulated and transmitted forward. Sometimes it is hidden and rediscovered, preserved for a future moment when it is needed by teachers who understood that the conditions for its full reception did not yet exist. Shambhala is, in this sense, a kind of living terma, a kingdom-sized treasure, hidden until the time is right for its full emergence. The landscape of Tibet itself, the landscape in which the Shambhala tradition developed and within which it has always been embedded, is worth inhabiting for a moment, because it shapes the tradition in ways that are easy to underestimate if you have not spent time thinking about what it is actually like to exist in that landscape. The Tibetan Plateau is the highest large plateau on Earth, averaging over 4,500 meters above sea level, surrounded by the highest mountain ranges on the planet. The Himalayas to the south, the Karakoram to the northwest, the Kunlun to the north. The sky over Tibet is a blue of extraordinary intensity, made more vivid by the altitude and the thinness of the atmosphere. The light has a quality that photographers and artists who have worked there consistently describe as unlike any other light on Earth. Brilliant, clear, capable of making distant features visible with a sharpness that the thicker air of lower altitudes does not permit. Distances are deceptive in this landscape. Ranges that appear close are hours of travel away. Valleys that appear to lead somewhere open into further valleys, further ranges, further distances. In this landscape, the idea of a hidden kingdom is not fantastical. It is almost geographically inevitable. The Tibetan Plateau contains enormous areas that were, until very recently, genuinely unexplored by outsiders and poorly mapped even by Tibetans. Hidden valleys, Bayul in the Tibetan tradition, are a recognized geographical and spiritual category. Places of special beauty and fertility concealed within the mountain landscape, accessible only through passes that are difficult to find and more difficult to traverse. The Bayul tradition is closely related to the Shambhala tradition. Hidden valleys are understood as places of refuge and practice, sheltered from the violence and confusion of the ordinary world, their concealment a feature rather than an accident. The landscape of Tibet teaches to those who live in it that concealment is a real geographical possibility, that the world contains places that are genuinely hard to find, and that what is hidden is not necessarily absent. Chapter 2: The Great Game and the Western Obsession. There is a moment in the history of Western engagement with the idea of Shambhala that is both entirely predictable and entirely bizarre. The moment when a sophisticated Tibetan Buddhist theological concept was picked up by European and American seekers, stripped of most of its philosophical context, and repackaged as a geographical mystery to be solved by the same methods that had been applied to the source of the Nile and the Northwest Passage. The Hidden Kingdom became, in the Western imagination of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a place to be found, literally, physically, geographically found, by the right expedition, with the right equipment and the right connections to the right colonial authorities. The contemplative path that the Tibetan tradition described as the only genuine route to Shambhala was set aside in favor of the approach that Western exploration culture knew best. Go there, walk, ride, climb, whatever it takes, map it, name it, claim it. This impulse was not entirely disconnected from genuine curiosity and genuine spiritual seeking. The people who became obsessed with finding Shambhala in the Western world were not, in most cases, simply greedy or naively literal-minded. They were people who had been genuinely moved by their encounter with the traditions of Tibet and Central Asia, who had found in those traditions something that their own cultural inheritance had not provided, and who translated that genuine spiritual hunger into the geographical idiom that was most available to them. But the translation involved losses that were significant and consequences that were sometimes catastrophic, and the history of Western Shambhala seeking is, among other things, a history of what happens when a concept is lifted out of the context that gives it meaning and inserted into a very different context with very different assumptions. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky is where the Western Shambhala obsession properly begins, though she did not use the word Shambhala extensively. Blavatsky was a Russian-born occultist who, in 1875, co-founded the Theosophical Society in New York City, an organization dedicated to the investigation of unexplained natural phenomena and the study of the comparative religion and philosophy of the East. Blavatsky claimed to have spent time in Tibet, though the evidence for this is uncertain, and she claimed to have received her teachings from a group of highly evolved spiritual masters, Mahatmas she called them, who lived in Tibet and who communicated with her through letters that materialized in a manner that impressed some observers and deeply skeptical others in a special cabinet at the Theosophical headquarters. The Mahatmas in Blavatsky's system are beings of extraordinary spiritual development who have chosen, out of compassion for humanity, to remain in physical existence rather than passing on to higher states in order to guide the development of human civilization. They live in hidden retreats in the Himalayas and in Tibet, communicating with select individuals whom they have chosen as instruments of their purposes. This is, structurally, a westernized version of concepts that do exist in Tibetan Buddhism. There are traditions of masters who remain in physical existence to continue teaching, and traditions of hidden masters whose influence is felt even when their physical location is not known. But Blavatsky's version differs from the Tibetan original in ways that tell you a great deal about the Western spiritual culture she was addressing. Her Mahatmas are individuals with names and personalities and the capacity to write letters in English. They are concerned with the specific spiritual needs of the Western world at a specific historical moment. They are, in short, calibrated to the needs of a Western audience that wanted access to Eastern wisdom, but wanted it translated into forms that were legible within a broadly Western framework of personality and communication. The hidden masters are real, Blavatsky is saying, but they will talk to you in your own language. You do not need to learn Tibetan. You do not need to undertake years of contemplative practice. You just need to be chosen. The Theosophical Society had an enormous cultural influence in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, far beyond its actual membership, because it was operating at exactly the right moment, a moment of widespread Western dissatisfaction with organized Christianity, growing awareness of Asian religious traditions through colonial contact and scholarly translation, and a cultural hunger for spiritual alternatives that the mainstream traditions did not seem to provide. Theosophy offered a synthesis, a grand unified theory of spiritual reality that incorporated Eastern concepts while remaining accessible to Western minds, that promised individual access to esoteric wisdom without requiring the kind of sustained, demanding practice that genuine engagement with Asian contemplative traditions would require. It was enormously appealing, and it spread rapidly through the cultural networks of the late Victorian and Edwardian world. Nicholas Roerich is the figure who most decisively connected the theosophical inheritance to the specific concept of Shambhala, and he did so in ways that were simultaneously artistically extraordinary and politically alarming. Roerich was a Russian painter and philosopher of remarkable talent and remarkable ambition. His paintings of the Himalayas, produced during his travels through Central Asia in the 1920s and 1930s, are genuinely beautiful works that capture the specific quality of light and scale in the high mountain landscape, with an accuracy and an emotional resonance that few other artists have achieved. He was also a mystic, a theosophist in the broad sense, deeply convinced that Shambhala was a real physical location and that he had a specific role to play in the unfolding of its emergence into the world, and he was an extraordinarily effective organizer and promoter of his own vision, with connections to political figures at the highest levels of multiple governments, including, critically, the United States government of the 1930s and the Soviet government of the same era. Roerich's Central Asian expedition of 1924 to 1928 is one of the most extraordinary journeys in the history of exploration, a transcontinental traverse of Central Asia from Sikkim through the Gobi Desert to Mongolia to Tibet, covering roughly 35,000 kilometers across some of the most difficult terrain on Earth, in conditions of considerable hardship and occasional genuine danger. Roerich traveled with his wife Helena and his son George, along with a rotating cast of companions and servants, and he documented the journey in journals and paintings of great vividness. He was looking for Shambhala, not necessarily expecting to find its physical location, but seeking contact with its energies, its influence, the signs of its impending emergence that he believed were visible in the landscape and the peoples of Central Asia if you knew how to read them. What Roerich was actually doing alongside the spiritual seeking was considerably more politically complex. He was, depending on which intelligence service was watching him at any given moment, either a Soviet agent, an American agent, a Japanese agent, or an independent actor pursuing his own pan-Asiatic political vision. And he may have been, at various points, some combination of all of these things. The political geography of Central Asia in the 1920s and 1930s was one of the most contested in the world, with the Soviet Union, British India, China, and Japan all competing for influence over the vast, thinly populated, strategically significant region. Roerich's idea, drawn from the Shambhala mythology reinterpreted through his theosophical lens, was that a new Buddhist confederation of Central Asian peoples could be organized around the Shambhala concept as a unifying spiritual and cultural identity. Shambhala, in Roerich's political vision, was not just a hidden kingdom, but a rallying point, a shared cultural memory that could unite the diverse Buddhist and Mongol peoples of Central Asia into a political force that would transform the region. This vision attracted the attention of various governments for various reasons, and Roerich spent decades negotiating the currents of international politics while simultaneously pursuing his artistic and spiritual work, a combination that was as dangerous as it sounds. His Tibetan expedition of 1934 and 1935, funded partly by Henry Wallace, the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture who would later become Vice President, ended in fiasco when the Tibetan government, suspicious of his political intentions, refused him entry, and he was stranded for months at the Tibetan border in conditions of severe hardship. The expedition became a political embarrassment for the Roosevelt administration, and Roerich's connection to Wallace became a political liability that his opponents used against both men in subsequent years. Roerich died in India in 1947, his grand vision of a Shambhala-centered Central Asian Confederation unrealized, his reputation damaged by the political controversies that had surrounded his later years, his paintings remaining as the most enduring legacy of an extraordinary and deeply complicated life. The British side of the Western Shambhala obsession produced its own remarkable figures and its own remarkable episodes. The Theosophist and Buddhist scholar Charles Leadbeater, the poet and mystic Talbot Mundy, the soldier and intelligence officer Francis Younghusband, who led the British military expedition to Lhasa in 1903 to 1904 that forced Tibet into the British sphere of influence, and who subsequently underwent a profound spiritual transformation that led him to found the World Congress of Faiths. All of these figures were touched in various ways by the Shambhala mythology and contributed to its spread and transformation in the Western world. Younghusband's case is particularly interesting because the man who led the most significant act of British imperial violence against Tibet subsequently became one of the most sincere advocates for the spiritual traditions of the region, and his late writings on the Hidden Kingdom have a quality of genuine remorse alongside the genuine seeking that makes them unusually human documents for the genre. The Nazi interest in Shambhala is the darkest and most consequential chapter of the Western engagement with the concept, and it deserves careful handling because it has been subject to considerable mythologization in both directions, enthusiastically amplified by writers who find the combination of Nazis and mysticism irresistible, and sometimes minimized by people who find it too embarrassing. The truth is somewhere in the middle, as it usually is. Heinrich Himmler, the SS chief who was the primary driver of Nazi racial ideology, was deeply interested in the occult and in the idea of a primordial Aryan civilization that had existed in Central Asia before the historical period, a civilization whose descendants were the Nordic peoples who carried in their blood the superior qualities that Nazi ideology attributed to the Aryan race. The concept of Shambhala filtered through theosophical channels and the racial pseudoscience of writers like Houston Stewart Chamberlain and Guido von List was incorporated into this mythology as a possible location of the original Aryan homeland, the place where the superior civilization had existed before being scattered by some prehistoric catastrophe. The SS Ahnenerbe, the Nazi organization dedicated to researching the origins of the Aryan race, sponsored an expedition to Tibet in 1938 and 1939, led by the zoologist Ernst Schaefer, which has been extensively written about and extensively mythologized. The expedition conducted genuine scientific research. It produced significant ornithological and zoological data, as well as ethnographic and anthropological observations. But it was also embedded in the ideological project of the regime that funded it, and some of the research it conducted was directed toward finding evidence for theories about Aryan origins that had no scientific basis. The expedition did not find Shambhala, partly because there was no Shambhala to find in the sense the ideology imagined, and partly because the Tibetan government was deeply suspicious of the Germans and limited their access to the interior of the country. The images from the expedition of SS officers in Tibet measuring the skulls of Tibetan monks in the service of racial pseudoscience are among the more disturbing photographs of the 20th century, a perfect encapsulation of the violent absurdity that results when a concept of great spiritual depth is stripped from its context and enlisted in the service of ideology. The appropriation of Shambhala by Western esoteric and political movements in the 20th century tells a consistent story about the relationship between the Western world and Eastern spiritual traditions in the colonial and post-colonial period. The traditions are genuine and deep and sophisticated, developed over centuries by serious practitioners working within contexts of great philosophical richness. They are also, from the perspective of Western seekers operating within their own cultural assumptions, difficult to access in their full complexity. They require languages that most Westerners do not speak, practices that require sustained commitment, and philosophical frameworks that are genuinely different from the frameworks within which Western thought operates. The response of many Western seekers was to take the most accessible and most spectacular elements of the traditions, the hidden kingdom, the enlightened masters, the prophecy of a coming golden age, and translate them into Western idioms that were more immediately legible, discarding in the process the contextual complexity that gave these elements their actual meaning. The result was something that bore a surface resemblance to the original but functioned quite differently. A Western Shambhala that was a geographical mystery to be solved, a political idea to be implemented, a racial fantasy to be confirmed, depending on who was doing the seeking and what they brought to it. The Tibetan Shambhala, meanwhile, continued to exist in its original form, in the texts and the practices and the living tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, largely indifferent to the uses the West was making of its name. Chapter 3: The Hidden Valleys and the Geography of Concealment. There is a practice in Tibetan Buddhism of seeking out places called Bayul, hidden valleys, concealed landscapes, places of special spiritual power that are not accessible to ordinary perception or ordinary travel. The Bayul tradition is ancient and extensive, and it is not metaphorical in the way that Western interpreters sometimes assume it is. The hidden valleys are understood within the tradition as real places, physically real, geographically locatable, actually situated in the landscape of the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau and the surrounding mountain ranges. They are hidden not because they do not exist, but because they cannot be entered by people who are not ready to enter them, and the preparation required to enter them is specific, demanding, and not achievable through geographical cleverness alone. The hiddenness is perceptual rather than physical, but the place itself is physical, and the distinction between these two kinds of hiddenness, the place that is hard to find because it is remote, and the place that is hard to find because the finder is not yet adequate to the finding, is one of the most philosophically rich distinctions in the entire Tibetan spiritual tradition. Padmasambhava, the 8th century Indian master who is credited with establishing Vajrayana Buddhism in Tibet, and who is one of the most revered figures in the entire Tibetan tradition, known by the epithet Guru Rinpoche, the precious teacher, is said to have concealed these valleys during his time in Tibet, hiding them from the turbulence and conflict that he foresaw would afflict the ordinary world in the centuries following his departure. The valleys were sealed by his blessing and by the specific perceptual preparation required to enter them, and they have remained sealed since then with occasional exceptions, moments when the conditions are right, when the appropriate person arrives, guided by a terma text that provides the inner and outer directions simultaneously and successfully makes the journey across the threshold that ordinary perception cannot cross. Padmasambhava's concealment of the Beul was not a simple act of geographical hiding. It was an act of cosmological engineering, a modification of the relationship between the human perceptual world and the physical landscape such that the valleys exist in the landscape but are not accessible to perception that has not been prepared to receive them. The most famous of the Himalayan hidden valleys is Pemako, a region in the extreme southeastern corner of Tibet, in the great bend of the Tsangpo River before it descends dramatically into the Indian subcontinent and becomes the Brahmaputra. Pemako is described in Tibetan texts as one of the greatest Beul, a place of extraordinary fertility and spiritual power, shaped like a deity in the landscape, its different parts corresponding to different aspects of the divine body, the mountains as the crown, the rivers as the veins, the fertile valleys as the heart. The Sangpo Gorge that runs through part of the region is one of the deepest river gorges on Earth, deeper than the Grand Canyon in places, carved over millions of years as the river maintained its course through the rising Himalayas, cutting downward at a rate that matched the upward movement of the mountains around it. The gorge drops roughly 7,000 meters over a distance of about 240 kilometers from the Tibetan plateau to the lowlands of Assam, and the environments it passes through change dramatically with altitude, from the spare, cold landscape of the high plateau through temperate forest and subtropical forest to the tropical lowlands at the bottom, each zone containing its own distinct ecology and its own distinct character. The mystery of whether there was a great waterfall hidden somewhere in the innermost gorge, the Tsangpo Falls that British survey officers had theorized from the river's total descent, and the known positions of measured waterfalls but had never confirmed, was one of the great geographical mysteries of the Victorian era. The race to solve it involved a remarkable series of expeditions by British surveyors, explorers, and botanists, many of whom were willing to risk their lives in terrain of extraordinary difficulty for the combination of geographical knowledge and personal glory that the discovery would provide. The Pundit explorers, the Indian surveyors secretly trained by the British Survey of India and sent into Tibet and the surrounding regions disguised as pilgrims, provided invaluable early information about the gorge, concealing their measuring equipment in prayer wheels and counting their steps to measure distances in territory where British surveyors could not go. Their reports confirmed the existence of a massive waterfall somewhere in the innermost gorge, a waterfall that accounted for a significant portion of the river's total descent, but the specific location and character of the falls remained unconfirmed for decades. The botanist Frank Kingdon Ward, who explored the Tsangpo Gorge in 1924 and 1925 in one of the last great Himalayan exploration expeditions of the classical era, found the disputed waterfall, the Yarlung Tsangpo Grand Falls, a cascade of about 30 meters, smaller than the legends had suggested but real and dramatic in its setting. He described it with a vividness that goes beyond the usual language of botanical collecting expeditions. The extraordinary vertical walls of the gorge around it, the mist that rose from the falls in columns visible for considerable distances, the specific quality of the light in the inner gorge that made everything appear slightly unreal, slightly more saturated in color than the ordinary world provides. Kingdon Ward was a careful and experienced observer who had spent decades in the Himalayan region, and his response to the inner gorge of the Tsangpo, the sense of being somewhere that existed outside the normal categories of landscape experience, was not the response of a credulous traveler seeing only what he wanted to see. It was the response of a trained naturalist encountering a landscape of genuinely extraordinary character. The American explorers Ian Baker and Hamid Sardar, who penetrated the innermost gorge of the Tsangpo in 1998 on an expedition described in Baker's book, The Heart of the World, found something that their Tibetan guides understood very specifically in terms of the Bayul tradition, a hidden waterfall previously unknown to outside explorers in the innermost section of the gorge, accessible only through days of extremely difficult travel through terrain that had defeated previous expeditions. The waterfall, subsequently named the Hidden Falls of Dorje Pagmo after the deity the Pemako landscape is understood to embody, drops roughly 35 meters in a location that the gorge's topography conceals from anyone approaching along the normal routes, visible only from a specific position that requires entering the gorge from below rather than from above. Baker describes the experience of approaching and finding the falls in terms that navigate carefully between the empirical and the experiential. He is not claiming supernatural experiences, but he is acknowledging that the journey through the landscape and the specific moment of discovering the falls produced in him and his companions states of awareness and perception that the ordinary vocabulary of adventure travel did not adequately capture. The falls were real, the journey was real, the landscape was real, and the quality of the experience exceeded what the description of the physical facts could convey, which is perhaps exactly what the Bayul tradition would predict. The relationship between the Bayul tradition and the Shambhala tradition is one of scale and degree rather than fundamental difference in kind. The Bayul are hidden valleys, accessible to individual practitioners with the appropriate preparation, serving as places of refuge and intensive practice for the individuals who reach them. Shambhala is a hidden kingdom, accessible or not yet accessible on a larger and more cosmologically significant scale, its concealment connected to world historical processes rather than individual spiritual development. But the underlying structure is the same, and the landscape in which both traditions are embedded is the same, the Himalayan and Tibetan landscape of extraordinary scale and extraordinary concealment, where the geography itself seems to participate in the logic of hiddenness that the traditions describe. The landscape does not merely contain the hidden places, it enacts the principle of hiddenness, producing through its own physical character, its scale, its complexity, its capacity to conceal vast areas of territory behind ranges that block vision and passes that defeat ordinary travel, the experiential reality of a world in which things of great significance exist without being accessible to ordinary perception. Consider what it is actually like to travel in this landscape, because the physical experience of the terrain is inseparable from the traditions that developed within it. The high passes of the Himalayas, the La in Tibetan, the mountain passes that are the arteries of travel through the range, are places of extreme conditions and extreme beauty that operate on the traveler in ways that are both physical and psychological, both obvious and subtle, both immediately noticeable and gradually cumulative. They are typically above 5,000 meters, often above 5,500, and they are reached by trails that ascend through a series of ecological zones from the forested valleys below, through the tree line into alpine meadows where the grass is short and dense and the wild flowers in summer are extraordinary in their concentration and variety, then through rocky terrain above the grass where the plants are increasingly small and increasingly adapted to cold and wind and the very short growing season that exists above 4,500 meters, then through snow and ice to the pass itself where nothing grows except the colored threads of prayer flags that have been placed there by generations of travelers making the same crossing. The ascent is physically demanding at any pace, and at altitude the body's response to the reduced oxygen creates a characteristic combination of physical difficulty and altered perception, a slight lightening of the mind, a tendency for individual moments to become more vivid and more fully present than they ordinarily are, a reduction in the ordinary background noise of thought that experienced high-altitude travelers describe as both challenging and, in certain circumstances, somewhat wonderful. The breath must be managed more carefully than at lower elevations. The pace must be slower. The attention naturally comes to rest on what is immediately present. The quality of the light, the texture of the rock underfoot, the sound of wind through the few plants that have managed to establish themselves above 5,000 meters, rather than on the planning and projecting and evaluating of ordinary mental activity. The altitude creates, involuntarily and without any spiritual practice or intention, something that resembles the quality of presence that contemplative traditions deliberately cultivate. The mountain teaches presence by making any other mode of attention physically impractical. At the pass itself, where prayer flags have been placed by generations of travelers, the colored cloth faded by wind and sun and snow to the pale, barely distinguishable remnants of color, each flag a prayer carried on the wind, each flag a record of a crossing and an aspiration. The view opens in every direction with a suddenness that the gradual ascent through enclosed terrain has not prepared you for. Behind you, the valley system you have traveled through, now reduced to a narrow groove in the landscape by the altitude from which you are viewing it. Ahead, the descending landscape of the other side, sometimes a completely different ecosystem, sometimes a completely different climate, the southern face of the Himalayas being wet and forested, the northern face being dry and opening onto the enormous distances of the Tibetan plateau where the eye can travel for 100 kilometers without encountering anything that interrupts the view. The transition is total and immediate. One step takes you from one world to another, from the familiar to the foreign, from the landscape that formed the tradition that describes Shambhala to the landscape that the tradition locates Shambhala within. The Bon tradition, the pre-Buddhist religious tradition of Tibet that predates the introduction of Buddhism by Padmasambhava in the 8th century, and that has maintained its own distinct identity and practice ever since, sometimes in conflict with Buddhism and sometimes in productive dialogue with it, has its own version of the hidden kingdom that is worth examining in some detail, both because it reveals how deep the hidden kingdom concept is in Tibetan culture, and because it suggests that the concept predates the Buddhist layer that later Western interpreters have treated as its primary context. The Bon hidden kingdom is called Olmo Lungring or Tagzig Olmo Lungring, and it is described in Bon texts with a geographical specificity that parallels the Kalachakra descriptions of Shambhala, a circular landscape surrounded by mountains centered on a sacred mountain called Yungdrung Gutseg, divided into sections by rivers flowing from a central lake, its population living in a state of extraordinary spiritual development under the guidance of enlightened teachers. The sacred mountain at the center of the Bon hidden kingdom, Yungdrung-Gutzeg, the 9 stacked swastikas, is identified in some Bon texts with the sacred mountain Kailash in western Tibet, which is one of the most significant sacred sites in the entire Himalayan religious world, venerated by Hindus and Buddhists and Jains, as well as Bon practitioners, as a mountain of cosmological significance, the axis mundi of the Indian and Tibetan religious world, the physical location on earth that is most directly connected to the divine order. The identification of the axis mundi mountain with the center of the hidden kingdom is theologically precise. The hidden kingdom is, in this reading, the region of the world most closely aligned with the cosmic center, the place where the connection between the human world and the divine order is most direct and most accessible to those who approach it with the appropriate preparation. The sacred geography of the Bon tradition and the sacred geography of the Shambhala tradition are not independent inventions. They are expressions of the same fundamental understanding of the Himalayan landscape as a place where the ordinary and the sacred are in unusually close proximity, where the human and the divine touch in ways that are not available in the flatter, more accessible, more thoroughly human-organized landscapes of the lowland world, the lakes of the Tibetan plateau, the high-altitude lakes that sit in the broad valleys between the mountain ranges, filled with water so clear and so cold that the reflection of the surrounding mountains in their surface has a quality of precision and depth that lowland lakes cannot match, are significant in the Shambhala tradition as markers of sacred geography, as the kind of place where the ordinary and the sacred meet in visible and tangible form. Lake Manasarovar, adjacent to Mount Kailash in western Tibet, is perhaps the most sacred lake in the Himalayan religious world, circumambulated by pilgrims of multiple traditions, its waters used in religious rituals across a vast geographical area, its presence in the landscape understood as a physical manifestation of a divine reality that the lake's extraordinary beauty makes directly perceivable. The quality of light on Lake Manasarovar at dawn, when the surrounding mountains are reflected in water that has the specific clarity of water that comes directly from glacial melt at 4,590 meters elevation, has been described by every tradition that has engaged with it as something that exceeds ordinary natural beauty and approaches a different category of experience. The direct perception of something sacred through the medium of something natural. The Terma tradition, the tradition of hidden teachings concealed by Padmasambhava and other great masters to be discovered at future times by appropriate discoverers, connects the Shambhala tradition to the broader Tibetan understanding of how sacred knowledge is transmitted across time. Terma are not simply written texts hidden in physical locations, though some are that. They are also mind termas, teachings concealed within the consciousness of specific individuals who are designated in advance to rediscover and transmit them at the appropriate future moment. And space termas, teachings concealed within the landscape itself, accessible through specific practices of perception and meditative awareness rather than through physical discovery. The Bayul are, in this framework, a kind of geographical terma, sacred landscapes concealed within the ordinary landscape, accessible to the appropriate discoverer at the appropriate time through the same combination of outer preparation and inner readiness that makes the discovery of other forms of terma possible. This understanding of the landscape as containing concealed sacred dimensions that become accessible through appropriate preparation is one of the most distinctive and most demanding aspects of the Tibetan spiritual tradition, and it is the context within which the Shambhala tradition must be understood if it is to be understood at all. The landscape of Tibet is not simply a physical backdrop for the tradition. It is a participant in the tradition, shaped by and shaping the understanding of what reality is and how it can be accessed. The mountains and the lakes and the passes and the hidden valleys are not merely picturesque features of a landscape that happens to contain a tradition. They are aspects of the tradition itself, the physical dimension of a teaching that is simultaneously geographical and psychological, simultaneously about the external world and about the internal world, and that understands these two dimensions as inseparable, as different aspects of a single reality that the tradition is learning through practice and through perception to see whole. The snow leopard moves through the high passes of the Himalayas with a silence and a self-containment that makes it almost impossible to see. An animal so perfectly adapted to its environment that it seems to be made of the same substance as the rocks and the snow, visible only by the specific quality of its absence, the way the landscape seems slightly incomplete in the places where it has just passed. The Tibetan tradition has a complex relationship with this animal. It appears in Thangka paintings as an emblem of the snow mountains, associated with the protective deities that inhabit the high places, and its presence in the landscape is understood as a sign of the landscape's wildness and its resistance to human domestication. To see a snow leopard in the Himalayas is, for the people of the tradition, something between a natural event and a sacred one, an encounter with a being that belongs to the part of the world that is most remote from the ordinary human world, most closely connected to whatever it is that the tradition calls sacred. And Shambhala in this landscape is where the snow leopard makes sense. A place of extraordinary concealment in a landscape of extraordinary beauty, accessible to the patient and the prepared, hidden not by walls but by the quality of the attention that is required to perceive it. Chapter 4. The Kingdom Within and the World Without. There is a question that runs through the entire history of Shambhala, through the Tibetan texts and the Mongolian prophecies and the Western expeditions and the Nazi appropriations and everything in between. A question that the tradition itself raises and addresses with considerable philosophical sophistication, and that remains genuinely alive and genuinely unanswered in a way that makes it worth sitting with, rather than resolving too quickly. The question is this: what kind of real is Shambhala? Not whether it is real. That question, framed in the blunt binary of the skeptic, misses what is most interesting about the tradition. But what kind of reality it occupies, what category of existence it belongs to, what the appropriate relationship is between the claims the tradition makes about it and the categories of verification that different ways of knowing make available. The question is not simple, and the tradition knows it is not simple, and the tradition's engagement with it across 1,000 years of text and practice and living transmission is one of the most intellectually serious engagements with the epistemology of the sacred that any religious tradition has produced. The Tibetan tradition's answer to this question is characteristically nuanced and characteristically demanding, and it cannot be reduced to either of the simple positions that the Western discussion of Shambhala tends to oscillate between: the credulous position that accepts all geographical claims at face value, and the dismissive position that reduces the entire tradition to metaphor or wish fulfillment. Shambhala is real, the tradition insists, not metaphorical, not merely symbolic, not a useful fiction for the spiritually unsophisticated who need geographical images to hold abstract truths. It is a real place with real geography, inhabited by real people living real lives in a community of real spiritual practice, and at the same time, it is not accessible by the methods that the ordinary, unexamined mind uses to verify reality, not findable by expedition, not mappable by satellite, not confirmable by the kind of empirical investigation that Western science has developed into the primary instrument of knowledge production. The reality of Shambhala is of a kind that requires a specific kind of instrument to detect, and that instrument is the purified, trained, disciplined mind of a genuine practitioner, a mind that has undergone the specific transformations that the Kala Chakra practice and its associated preliminary practices produce, that has developed the specific capacities of perception and awareness that allow the ordinary barriers to Shambhala's detection to be overcome. This position is philosophically coherent, and understanding why it is coherent requires engaging with the Tibetan philosophical tradition's understanding of perception and reality, an understanding that is considerably more sophisticated than the common-sense realism that most Western thinkers bring to questions of whether things exist. The Tibetan philosophical tradition, drawing on the rich heritage of Indian Buddhist epistemology developed by thinkers like Dignaga and Dharmakirti, and elaborated over centuries of Indian and Tibetan scholastic philosophy, understands perception as an active process rather than a passive one, not the simple reception by a neutral mind of information from an independently existing world, but the construction of experience through the interaction of the perceiving mind with what is available to be perceived. Different minds, trained in different ways, possessing different qualities of attention and awareness, will genuinely perceive different things when looking at the same situation, not because they are mistaken about what is there, but because what is accessible to perception depends on the quality of the perceiver as much as on the nature of what is being perceived. This understanding of perception, which has interesting parallels in certain strands of Western philosophy of mind, and in aspects of quantum mechanics that are genuinely controversial but genuinely discussed by serious physicists, means that the claim that Shambhala is imperceptible to ordinary perception is not a claim that it is subjective or imaginary. It is a claim about the relationship between the quality of a particular mode of perception and the range of what that mode can access. Radio waves are not perceptible to human senses unaided, but they are real, and the instrument required to detect them is real, and the reading produced by the instrument is real information about a real phenomenon. The Tibetan tradition's claim about Shambhala is structurally similar. Not that the kingdom is imaginary, but that the instrument required to perceive it is not the ordinary unexamined human mind, but the trained, purified, contemplatively developed mind of a genuine practitioner, and that this instrument, when developed, produces real perception of a real place. The 20th century produced a number of serious Western scholars who engaged with the Shambhala tradition in ways that went beyond both the credulous seeking of the theosophists and the dismissive skepticism of the rationalists. Edwin Birnbaum, whose 1980 book, The Way to Shambhala, remains one of the most thoughtful Western treatments of the subject, approached the tradition with the combination of scholarly rigor and genuine personal engagement that the material requires. Birnbaum spent time in Nepal and Tibet, studied the relevant texts in their original languages with native scholar guidance, and interviewed practitioners who had deep personal relationships with the tradition, and his conclusions represent a genuinely sophisticated engagement with the question of what kind of reality Shambhala occupies. His argument that Shambhala functions simultaneously on multiple levels as a physical place that may or may not be accessible to ordinary means, as a state of mind representing the goal of contemplative practice, and as a cultural and psychological symbol of extraordinary productive power, is not a way of avoiding the question of Shambhala's reality. It is a way of recognizing that the question of reality is itself more complex than either the credulous or the dismissive position acknowledges, that the category real is not a simple binary but a spectrum with multiple dimensions, and that Shambhala's power as a tradition comes precisely from its capacity to operate across all of those dimensions simultaneously. The Dalai Lama's relationship with the Shambhala tradition illustrates how the concept functions within the living Tibetan Buddhist tradition as distinct from its Western interpretations, and what it reveals is instructive for understanding the tradition's full character. The Dalai Lama has given the Kalachakra initiation the central ritual of the tradition within which Shambhala plays its most important role. Dozens of times over his long career as the spiritual and political leader of the Tibetan people, to audiences that have ranged from small groups of serious practitioners in traditional Tibetan settings to gatherings of hundreds of thousands of people in large outdoor venues in India and Europe and the United States. The scale of the Kalachakra gatherings has grown dramatically over the course of his tenure. The 2012 Kalachakra in Washington, D.C. attracted approximately 10,000 practitioners from around the world, and subsequent initiations in India have drawn much larger crowds, and this growth reflects both the increasing global interest in Tibetan Buddhism and the specific political dimensions that the Kalachakra has acquired in the context of the Tibetan diaspora and the ongoing occupation of Tibet by China. Each time the Dalai Lama gives the Kalachakra initiation, he addresses the question of Shambhala directly and with a consistency that reveals his considered position on the matter. Shambhala is real, he says. It is a real place, not a metaphor or a symbol or a pious fiction. It cannot be found by ordinary means. The path to it is through practice. These statements are not in tension with each other in his understanding. They describe different aspects of a single complex reality, and the person who finds them contradictory is bringing to the question an epistemological framework that the tradition considers inadequate to the question being asked. He does not encourage people to organize expeditions to find Shambhala geographically. He does not discourage them from visualizing Shambhala as a physical place when they practice the Kalachakra visualization practices, which explicitly require the practitioner to imagine the kingdom in geographical detail. He treats the question with the patience and the precision of someone who has spent a lifetime with the tradition and has a comprehensive view of its multiple dimensions and their relationships to each other. The political dimension of the Shambhala tradition, the eschatological promise that the kingdom will emerge from its concealment at a time of world crisis and contribute to the transformation of the human situation, has acquired specific resonance in the context of the Tibetan diaspora and the continuing occupation of Tibet. The tradition's promise of eventual restoration and renewal, the guarantee that the forces of wisdom and compassion are real and active even when hidden, that the current period of darkness and difficulty is not permanent, that history has a direction and that direction is ultimately toward liberation. These elements of the Shambhala mythology speak directly and powerfully to a community that has experienced the loss of its homeland and the destruction of its institutional religious life and the ongoing suppression of its cultural identity under Chinese occupation. The The Shambhala tradition in this context is not simply a theological concept. It is a spiritual resource for endurance, a framework within which the current suffering of the Tibetan people can be understood as temporary and ultimately meaningful, as part of a pattern that the tradition describes and that ends eventually in restoration. This political and pastoral dimension of the Shambhala tradition is ancient. The Mongolian relationship with the tradition in the 19th and early 20th centuries demonstrated the same pattern, the tradition serving as a spiritual resource for endurance and resistance in a period of political difficulty and cultural suppression. The Mongolian version of the Shambhala prophecy was, in the decades of Qing dynasty dominance and then Soviet influence, a significant force in Mongolian Buddhist nationalism. The expectation that the kingdom's emergence was approaching, that the forces of Dharma were gathering for the decisive confrontation with the forces of ignorance and oppression, gave to the Mongolian Buddhist community a sense of cosmological significance that the political situation on the surface of history could not provide. The tradition functioned as a source of dignity and purpose in circumstances designed to strip both away. The Roerich expedition and its complex political entanglements, which we have already examined in the previous chapter, illustrate the dangers of the tradition's political dimension when it is separated from the contemplative and philosophical context that normally keeps it grounded. When the Shambhala mythology is extracted from the full Tibetan tradition and offered as a political program, a call to arms, a justification for specific geopolitical actions, a mandate for the construction of specific institutional structures, it loses the epistemological humility and the ethical sophistication that the full tradition provides. The full tradition is explicit about the limits of what can be known about Shambhala's emergence and the appropriate human response to those limits. The response is practice, cultivation, the patient development of the qualities of mind and heart that the tradition identifies as prerequisites for the kingdom's emergence, not political action on behalf of a specific interpretation of the prophecy. Roerich's interpretation removed the epistemological humility and replaced it with political certainty, and the result was predictably damaging to his own project, to the people who were involved in it, and to the reputation of the tradition itself in the Western world. The concept of the Pure Land in Buddhist cosmology, more broadly, provides an important context for understanding Shambhala's specific character within the spectrum of Buddhist afterlife and otherworld traditions. The Pure Lands of Mahayana Buddhism, the Buddha fields, the realms of specific Buddhas in which the conditions for liberation are perfectly arranged, are understood in the tradition as simultaneously real and accessible, available to beings who have cultivated the appropriate connection to the Buddha of that field, either through rebirth in the Pure Land after death or, in more advanced traditions, through recognition of the Pure Land's nature in the present moment. The relationship between these Pure Land traditions and the Shambhala tradition reveals something important about how the Tibetan tradition understands the relationship between transcendence and immanence, between the sacred and the ordinary, between what exists and what can be perceived to exist. The Pure Land traditions generally understand the Buddha fields as genuinely existing alongside the ordinary world, not in a different spatial location exactly, but in a different relationship with ordinary perception, accessible to purified perception in the same way that Shambhala is accessible to the purified perception that the Kalachakra practice develops. The ordinary world and the Pure Land are not two different places. They are two different ways of perceiving the same place, or two different dimensions of the same reality, accessible through two different qualities of mind. The practitioner who achieves the recognition of the pure land nature of ordinary experience has not traveled to a different location. They have developed a different quality of perception that allows them to see what was always there, the sacred dimension of the ordinary, the Buddha field within the world, the Shambhala that was always present and was always inaccessible to ordinary perception. This understanding that Shambhala is not a different place but a different dimension of this place, accessible through the development of a different quality of perception, is the tradition's most challenging and most philosophically interesting claim, and it is the claim that connects the Shambhala tradition most directly to the broader Buddhist philosophical project of understanding the relationship between ordinary experience and the liberated experience that practice is meant to produce. The practitioner who reaches Shambhala has not traveled to Central Asia. They have traveled into the nature of their own mind, have developed the perceptual capacity that allows them to see the Shambhala nature of whatever place they are in, have discovered that the hidden kingdom was never somewhere else but was always here, concealed by the same quality of ordinary perception that conceals the nature of mind from itself, accessible through the same practice that reveals the nature of mind to itself. The snow leopard, patient and concealed and perfectly adapted to a landscape that most humans find incomprehensible in its demands, moves through the high passes as it has always moved, as present and as invisible as it has ever been. The Tsangpo continues to roar through its gorge. The hidden waterfall continues to fall in its concealed location. The Bayul continue to exist in their specific locations in the Himalayan landscape, accessible to those who are prepared to find them and invisible to those who are not. The prayer flags at the high passes continue to fade and tatter and carry their prayers into the Himalayan wind, and the Shambhala tradition continues to insist with a patience and a specificity that 8 centuries of Western skepticism and appropriation and misunderstanding have not diminished, that the kingdom is there, patient, concealed, complete, waiting not for the development of better satellite imaging or more rigorous expedition planning, but for the development of the quality of mind that is the only instrument adequate to the perception of what has always been and continues to be, exactly where it was always said to be, here, closer than the nearest mountain, further than the most distant star, as accessible as the full presence of this moment, and as hidden as the nature of the mind that is experiencing it. The work of finding Shambhala is the work of becoming someone who can perceive Shambhala, and that work is the work of practice, daily, unglamorous, essentially private, requiring the same qualities of patience and commitment and willingness to endure discomfort in service of something larger than personal comfort that the tradition has always required of its practitioners. It is the work that the Norns do at the root of Yggdrasil, continuous, unremarked, essential. It is the work that the anonymous gardeners did in the Hanging Gardens, tending what sustains life, making possible what appears miraculous, never receiving the credit for what their labor makes available to others. It is the work of the human being willing to take seriously the possibility that the most important things are not the most visible things, that the kingdom worth finding is the one whose location is described not by coordinates but by qualities of heart and mind, that the map that leads to Shambhala is the map of the practitioner's own development, and the destination is not a place on that map but the capacity to read the map correctly, which is, when it is finally achieved, the same thing as arriving. And here, at the end of our long journey through the high passes and the hidden valleys and the complicated history of the world's most philosophically rich hidden kingdom, we come to rest. We have traveled a considerable distance tonight, from the Kalachakra texts of 11th century Tibet through the Theosophical societies of Victorian New York and London, through the extraordinary journeys of Nicholas Roerich and the dark episode of the Nazi Ahnenerbe, and the gentle, rigorous scholarship of the people who tried to understand the tradition on its own terms, and finally into the philosophical heart of the concept itself, the idea of the hidden perfect place that is simultaneously a geographical reality and a state of mind and a stage of practice and a prophecy and a mirror held up to the deepest human longing for things to be as good as they could be. What does Shambhala mean at the end of all that? It means, I think, something that every tradition of genuine depth eventually arrives at. The recognition that the distance between the world as it is and the world as it could be is not simply a geographical one. You cannot travel to Shambhala the way you travel to a city. You cannot find it the way you find a lost archaeological site. The journey requires the kind of change that is harder and slower and more demanding than any physical journey, and the destination it arrives at is not somewhere else, but somewhere deeper, a quality of perception, a clarity of awareness, a warmth of heart that recognizes in the ordinary world and in the ordinary life already being lived what the mythology has always been pointing toward. Outside, the night is whatever the night is where you are, cool or warm, urban or rural, accompanied by traffic or by wind or by the specific silence that descends on certain places at certain hours. And here, in the quiet of wherever you are, the hidden kingdom is as close as it has ever been to anyone who was looking for it. Not close in the sense of almost found, about to be discovered. Close in the sense that it has always been close as the quality of attention you are bringing to this moment, as close as the degree of clarity and warmth that is available to you right now, in this breath, in this room, in this particular darkness. Let Shambhala go for tonight. Let it return to its hiding place in the high ranges, concealed behind its mountains of reflected light, warm and green and patient in its own impenetrable way. You have come close enough for one night. The journey itself, the willingness to look, the genuine curiosity about what might be hidden in the world's most demanding landscapes, that is already a form of the preparation the tradition describes. Sleep well in whatever kingdom you have made for yourself. It is in its own way exactly where you need it to be.